to figure out the sign, and that's SIGN, so whether we're positive or negative, depending on what quadrant my angle ends up in, there's 4 little letters you want to remember. Those letters are A, S, T, C. And that's a way to remember what's positive in each quadrant. Here's what the letters stand for. A means all things are going to be positive. So if our angle ends up in quadrant 1, everything's positive, sine, cosine, and tangent. If we end up in quadrant 2, the sine is positive. Everything else is going to be negative, with the exception of the reciprocal of sine. So maybe we'll put a note about the cosecant is also positive. The t, I'm guessing you get what these are going to stand for. If I end up in quadrant 3, that tells me that tangent is positive and everything else is negative, with the exception of its reciprocal. And then finally, if I end up in quadrant 4, that tells me the cosine is positive and everything else would be negative, with the exception of its reciprocal. So here's how this chart works. I want to figure out the sign, SIGN, of these angles, whether they're positive or negative. So let's take 255 degrees. I need to figure out what quadrant 255 degrees ends up in. That's going to end up in quadrant 3. So that tells me, since I'm in quadrant 3, tangent is going to be positive. Everything else is going to be negative. So I don't even really care what the sign of 255 is. I know it's going to come up negative. Okay, that's how the chart works. Next up, I gave you one in radians just to kind of deal with radians. If you really need to, you can convert that into degrees to figure out what quadrant that's in. But let me just remind you real quick of how to graph this using radians. What I'd recommend you do is change 9/4 into a decimal. So that comes out negative 2.25 pi. Which may make this easier to graph dealing with radians. What this tells me is that I'm rotating backwards, clockwise, and I'm going to do more than a complete rotation because one time around the circle is 2 pi radians. Recall that down here is 0.5 radians, or 0.5 pi radians, so I'm not going to get quite there. I'm going to end up somewhere in quadrant 4. In fact, if you change this into degrees, you'd see that I believe, going from memory, that was negative 405 degrees. So regardless, it ends up in quadrant 4. What that tells me in quadrant 4, if I were to do the cosine of that angle, it's going to come out to be something positive. If I were to do anything else, though, it would come out negative.